He tore up my contract laughing, but when he read the fine print, Deborah Miller felt her heart race as she heard the sound of paper being shredded. For 5 years, she had cared for Mrs. Eleanor with absolute dedication, and now Richard, the woman's son-in-law, was laughing as he tossed the pieces of her employment contract into the air like confetti. It was then that he spoke the words she would never forget. "The free ride's over, sweetheart. My mother-in-law is going to a nursing home tomorrow and you can find another job. This paper is worthless." Richard guffawed, adjusting his glasses as he stared at the fragments scattered across the living room floor. Deborah stood motionless, watching the dark-haired, well-groomed man celebrate as if he'd just won the lottery. She had no idea that at that very moment, she had just set in motion a chain of events that would completely change their lives. "But Mr. Richard, this contract was notarized," Deborah murmured, her voice trembling. "Notarized? Ha! My mother-in-law has dementia. She can't sign anything valid. Any judge will see that." What Richard didn't know was that Mrs. Eleanor, seemingly asleep in her brown leather armchair, heard every word. The 78-year-old woman had spent 40 years working as a family law attorney, and every comma in that contract had been carefully considered. Mrs. Eleanor discreetly squeezed Deborah's hand, a signal they had agreed upon months earlier. It was time to put the plan into action. "I'll start looking for nursing homes today. Nothing cheap or the neighbors will talk," Richard continued, picking up his phone. "You have until tomorrow to pack your things and leave." Deborah slowly bent down to gather the torn pieces of the contract. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from a mix of anger and anticipation. As she collected the fragments, her trained eyes, she had been a secretary for 20 years before becoming a caregiver, noticed something peculiar in the fine print that remained legible. What she saw made her smile for the first time that terrible afternoon. "Mrs. Eleanor, may I take these pieces to throw away?" she asked, her voice steadier now. The elderly woman nodded, keeping her eyes closed. Richard, already distracted by his call to a nursing home, didn't even notice when Deborah left the room, carrying what he thought was a worthless document. In Mrs. Eleanor's bedroom, Deborah closed the door and began arranging the fragments on the bed. Like a puzzle, she pieced together the torn pages. Her heart pounded as she confirmed what she had glimpsed moments earlier. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. The fine print contained clauses Richard could never have imagined. The first one was devastating. In the event of any unilateral attempt to terminate this contract by the contracting party's family members without her express consent while in sound mental capacity, all previously granted powers of attorney to said family members shall be immediately revoked. But there was more, much more. The second clause stated that any interference in the contractual relationship between Mrs. Eleanor and her caregiver would trigger the immediate activation of a security fund the elderly woman had set up years prior. The fund, managed by a law firm in New York City, would ensure not only the continuation of Deborah's employment, but also her legal protection against any form of pressure. The third clause was the most surprising. It granted Deborah the legal right to block any changes to Mrs. Eleanor's routine or residence without an independent medical evaluation, proving the necessity of such measures. Deborah Miller sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the torn pieces of the contract to her chest. For 5 years, she had watched Richard pressure his mother-in-law to sell the house, change her will, and part with valuable belongings. Mrs. Eleanor had always resisted with grace, but Deborah could see the pain in the older woman's eyes. "How did you foresee all this?" she whispered to herself. The answer came in the form of a memory. Months earlier, when Richard had tried to convince a private doctor to declare Mrs. Eleanor mentally unfit, the elderly woman had asked Deborah to accompany her to a routine checkup. In reality, she had gone to a specialized geriatric clinic, where she underwent a full battery of cognitive tests. The report, which Deborah now understood was part of the plan, confirmed not only Mrs. Eleanor's perfect mental clarity, but also her exceptional capabilities for someone her age. The document was attached to the original contract, a copy Richard had never seen. That evening, while Richard celebrated at the club's bar with friends, Boasting about how he'd rid himself of the leech who cared for his mother-in-law, Deborah and Mrs. Eleanor had a conversation that would change everything. "My dear, I knew this day would come," Mrs. Eleanor said, her steady voice belying her apparent fragility. "Richard isn't a bad person, but greed has blinded him. It's time he learned a lesson." "You really planned all this?" "When you've spent a lifetime dealing with disputed inheritances and shattered families, you learn to protect yourself. But you also learn that sometimes people need a shock to wake them up." Mrs. Eleanor rose from her armchair with more agility than she ever showed when Richard was around. She walked to the study, and from a safe hidden behind a shelf of legal books, pulled out a folder full of documents. "Richard always thought I kept money in here. In truth, I kept something far more valuable: the truth." Inside the folder, Deborah found audio recordings, photographs, and even videos documenting years of psychological pressure. Richard trying to coerce his mother-in-law into signing power of attorney, threatening to abandon her, showing up drunk to demand borrowed money. "Why did you never say anything?" "Because I still hoped he would change, but when he started threatening you, I knew the time had come." The truth was that Richard had lost his job 6 months earlier and hidden it from his wife. Desperate for money, he saw his mother-in-law's house as his only salvation. What he didn't know was that Mrs. Eleanor had discovered everything through her network of contacts in town. The next morning, Richard arrived at the house with nursing home paperwork and a moving van. He found the door locked and a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Neighbors, local shopkeepers, the mailman, even the priest from the church Mrs. Eleanor had attended for 30 years. "What's going on here?" he shouted, trying to force the door open. "Mr. Richard," said Mrs. Martha, the 70-year-old neighbor who had known the family for decades, "we received a letter explaining the situation. We won't let you take Mrs. Eleanor away against her will." "This is none of your business. She's my mother-in-law." "And we've witnessed how you treat her," retorted Mr. Walter, the bakery owner. "Years of seeing this woman in tears after your visits." Richard tried to force his way in, but realized the locks had been changed. Furious, he grabbed his phone to call his wife, only to discover she too had received a letter that would change his life forever. It laid bare everything he had hidden: the unemployment, the debts, the attempts to manipulate Mrs. Eleanor. But the most devastating part was the photographs showing Richard in compromising situations, spending money he claimed not to have on bars and bets. Jennifer, his wife, arrived at her mother-in-law's house in tears. When she saw her husband trying to break down the door, she realized everything in the letter was true. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Later, Jennifer. Right now, I need to handle this." "No, now. I received documents proving you lied to me about everything." It was then that a moving company van pulled up in front of the house, but it wasn't there to take Mrs. Eleanor's furniture. It was there to collect Richard's belongings, which Jennifer had packed. "What are you doing?" he asked, stunned. "What I should have done months ago. You chose to lie. You chose to exploit a 78-year-old woman. You chose to betray me in every possible way." Inside the house, Deborah watched the scene from the window while Mrs. Eleanor remained calm in her armchair. The elderly woman had even anticipated her daughter-in-law's reaction, including it in her protection plan. "Do you think you went too far?" Deborah asked. "My dear, sometimes true love requires drastic measures. Richard needs to hit rock bottom to rise again." What followed were chaotic days for Richard. He discovered he couldn't access his mother-in-law's bank accounts because the power of attorney had been automatically revoked when he tore up the contract. Worse still, he learned that every lawyer in town refused to take his case out of respect for Mrs. Eleanor's reputation. Meanwhile, Deborah received an unexpected visit. It was Stephanie Wilson, a young lawyer sent by the New York City firm managing the trust fund Mrs. Eleanor had established. "Mrs. Miller, I'm here to formalize your new legal status. From now on, you are officially the legal guardian of Mrs. Eleanor, with full judicial authority to make all necessary decisions for her well-being." Deborah could hardly believe it. In 1 week, she had gone from a caregiver threatened with dismissal to the person legally responsible for protecting Mrs. Eleanor. But how is this possible? Mrs. Eleanor prepared everything 2 years ago. She foresaw the day she'd need legal protection from family pressure. The trust she created not only guarantees your salary indefinitely, but also provides full legal support. The lawyer presented documents revealing the extent of Mrs. Eleanor's planning. There were updated medical reports, authenticated recordings, prepared witnesses, and even a detailed care plan for the coming years. She truly thought of everything, Deborah murmured, moved. Mrs. Eleanor once told me something I'll never forget. Stephanie, old age doesn't leave us defenseless if we plan wisely. And sometimes protecting ourselves means protecting those who truly love us. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. 3 weeks after the incident, Richard was living in a rented room downtown. Jennifer had filed for divorce and taken the children to her parents' house. He had lost not only the chance to inherit from his mother-in-law, but also his family and reputation. Then, he received an envelope delivered personally by Deborah. "Mrs. Eleanor asked me to give this to you," she said, no hostility in her voice. Inside the envelope was an old photo of a young Richard, smiling beside Mrs. Eleanor on his wedding day with Jennifer. On the back, in the elderly woman's careful handwriting, was written, "I still remember the young man who promised to take care of my daughter. Is he still out there?" Along with the photo was a card with the address of a support center for people facing financial hardship. It wasn't money, but it was a chance. Richard stared at the photo for hours. He remembered how Mrs. Eleanor had welcomed him into the family with warmth, how she had helped him in the early years of his marriage, how she celebrated every achievement of his as if he were her own son. The transformation wasn't immediate. Richard had to face the reality of his choices and seek help for the gambling addiction he had secretly developed. The center Mrs. Eleanor had recommended offered not just psychological support, but also career placement. During this time, Deborah Miller became fully established as Mrs. Eleanor's companion and protector. The house turned into an even more welcoming space, with daily visits from friends and neighbors who admired the dignity with which the elderly woman had handled the situation. "You know, Deborah, I didn't do all this out of spite," Mrs. Eleanor said one afternoon as they had tea in the garden. "I did it out of love. Love for you, who dedicated yourself to me without asking for anything in return, and love for Richard, who needed a boundary to keep from destroying himself completely." Deborah understood more and more the complexity of the situation. Mrs. Eleanor wasn't just an elderly woman protecting herself from a greedy son-in-law. She was a wise woman using her experience to save the family from a greater tragedy. "Do you really think he can change?" "My dear, I've spent 40 years watching families tear themselves apart over money, but I've also seen miracles happen when people hit rock bottom and decide to start over." 6 months later, Jennifer sought out Mrs. Eleanor. Her daughter was thin, with deep shadows under her eyes, carrying the weight of a decision that had completely changed her life. "Mum, I don't know if I did the right thing," she said, sitting in the same armchair where her mother used to rest. "Sweetheart, you did what was necessary, but that doesn't mean it has to be forever." Jennifer revealed that Richard had sought treatment, found a new job, and was trying to reconcile with their children. He sent letters every week, not asking for forgiveness but sharing his efforts to change. "He's not asking to come back, Mom. He just wants me to know he's trying to be a better person." Mrs. Eleanor smiled. That was exactly the reaction she had hoped for from her plan. Richard wasn't trying to manipulate or pressure. He was genuinely changing. "And what does your heart tell you?" "That I'm afraid. Afraid to believe and be disappointed again." It was Deborah who suggested a solution. She had become not just a caregiver, but a true family counselor. What if we allowed supervised visits, here at the house where everyone would feel safe to talk? Mrs. Eleanor agreed immediately. The house had become a place of healing, and perhaps it was the perfect setting for the family to begin rebuilding. Richard's first visit after 8 months was awkward. He arrived with a bouquet of flowers for his mother-in-law and a handwritten letter for Deborah, apologizing for his past behavior. "Mrs. Eleanor, I don't even know where to begin," he said, visibly nervous. "How about starting by telling me how you're really doing?" Richard spoke about his treatment, his new job as a sales clerk at an electronics store, the therapy sessions that helped him understand his own actions. I realized I've always been afraid of not being enough, and when I lost my job, that fear turned into desperation. I thought money would fix everything, but it only made things worse. Mrs. Eleanor listened carefully without judgment. Deborah remained present too, observing the sincerity in his words. Richard, admitting your mistakes is the first step, but real change happens in the small actions of everyday life. I know. That's why I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I need to prove I've changed, not just say it. The visits became weekly. Richard brought reports of his progress in treatment, showed proof of his new job, and talked about the books he was reading to become a better person. Jennifer started joining the visits, first reluctantly, then with growing interest. She saw real changes in her ex-husband's behavior, but still kept a safe distance. "He seems different," she remarked to Deborah one afternoon. "More humble." "People can change when they truly want to," Deborah replied, having witnessed the transformation firsthand. The turning point came 9 months after the contract was destroyed. Richard arrived for his weekly visit, carrying a folder of documents. "Mrs. Eleanor, I brought something to show you." Inside the folder was a new contract, but this time it was Richard officially renouncing any claim to his mother-in-law's inheritance and setting up a monthly donation from his salary to organizations that cared for the elderly. "I don't want you to think I'm doing this to gain anything in return. It's because I finally understand the harm I caused." Mrs. Eleanor read the document carefully. It was meticulously prepared with no loopholes for future regrets. "Richard, are you sure about this?" "Absolutely. I want you to live the rest of your life in peace, knowing I'll never pressure you for money or inheritance again." It was then that Mrs. Eleanor did something unexpected. She rose from her chair, walked to the hidden safe, and pulled out another folder. "Then it's time to show you this." The folder contained the 5th and final clause of the original contract, the one even Deborah didn't know about. It stated that if Richard demonstrated genuine remorse and proven behavioral change, all restrictions would be lifted and he would be readmitted as a son in the family. You always knew I could change?" Richard asked, tears in his eyes. "I hoped, my son. I always hoped." The hug that followed carried years of pain, regret, and forgiveness. Jennifer cried as she watched, and even Deborah was moved. "But this doesn't mean everything will go back to how it was," Mrs. Eleanor continued. "It means we can build something new, based on honesty and respect." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now back to the story. The months that followed brought a completely new family dynamic. Richard and Jennifer began a slow, careful reconciliation, with Mrs. Eleanor's loving guidance and Deborah's practical support. The house became the heart of a reborn family. The children started visiting their grandmother regularly again, finding a transformed father and a healthier family dynamic. Richard gradually took on some responsibilities in caring for his mother-in-law, always under Deborah's supervision. He helped with small tasks, accompanied her to doctor's appointments, and showed genuine concern for her well-being. "You know, Deborah, I never properly thanked you for everything you've done for our family," he said one afternoon, while helping organize Mrs. Eleanor's medications. "I just did my job." "No, you did much more. You protected someone I love when I was too lost to do it myself." Richard's transformation was clear to everyone. He had lost weight, cut his hair, and most importantly, shed the desperate, anxious look he once had. He worked diligently, saved money, and kept his promised donations to charity. Jennifer watched these changes with a mix of hope and caution. The divorce hadn't been finalized yet, but she was starting to consider a gradual reconciliation. "Mom, how did you know he could change?" she asked during one of their tea afternoons in the garden. "Dear, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn to see beyond what people show on the surface. Richard was always a good person at heart. Pressure and fear turned him into someone he wasn't." Mrs. Eleanor revealed she had studied psychology during her years in law, understanding that many family problems had deep emotional roots. Sometimes, To save someone we love, we first have to let them lose themselves completely. Only then can they find their way back. The elderly woman's wisdom even impressed Deborah, who was nearly 50 and considered herself experienced. "Mrs. Eleanor, you really planned every detail, didn't you?" "My dear, I spent 2 years observing, planning and waiting. I knew Richard would reach his breaking point, and when he did, I'd be ready to help him find himself again." A year and a half after the torn contract incident, the family had found a new balance. Richard and Jennifer lived in separate apartments, but spent weekends together at Mrs. Eleanor's house with the children. Their reconciliation was progressing, slowly and maturely. Both were in individual and couples therapy, working to build a stronger relationship. Deborah remained Mrs. Eleanor's primary caregiver, but had also become a sort of family counselor. Her presence had become essential to maintaining harmony in the household. "You know I won't live forever," Mrs. Eleanor said one afternoon with the whole family gathered, "and when the time comes, I wanted to make sure I'd leave you united, not fighting." "Don't talk like that, Grandma," said her 12-year-old granddaughter, hugging her. "It's natural, sweetheart. What matters is that now I know when that moment comes, you'll all be fine. You'll take care of each other." Mrs. Eleanor had created more than a legal protection plan. She had orchestrated the healing of an entire family. 2 years after the incident, Richard and Jennifer remarried in a simple ceremony in Mrs. Eleanor's garden. The elderly woman was radiant, knowing her plan had worked perfectly. "Deborah, thank you for trusting me when everything seemed lost," Mrs. Eleanor said on the wedding day. "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes true love requires the courage to stand firm." The celebration was small but meaningful. Neighbors who had witnessed the difficult times now celebrated the reconciliation. The priest who had supported Mrs. Eleanor during the crisis blessed the new marriage. Richard gave an emotional speech, thanking his mother-in-law for not giving up on him when he had given up on himself. "Mrs. Eleanor taught me that family isn't about inheritance or money. It's about love, patience, and second chances." From that day on, the house felt even more alive. The children had their parents back together. Mrs. Eleanor had her family at peace, and Deborah had found not just a job, but a true family. "You know what I'm most proud of in this story?" Mrs. Eleanor said to Deborah one quiet afternoon. "What?" "That we managed to save Richard from himself without destroying him. Sometimes people need firm boundaries to find the right path." Deborah now understood she had been part of something far greater than she'd imagined. She hadn't just been an employee protecting her job, she'd been an instrument of family healing. "You're a very wise woman." "No, my dear. I'm just a woman who's lived long enough to understand that true love sometimes has to be hard before it can be sweet." 3 years later, when Mrs. Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep, she left behind a united family and a lesson that would be passed down for generations. Richard had become a respectable man, Jennifer a confident wife and mother, and Deborah a second mother to all. In the will, read during a quiet family gathering, Mrs. Eleanor left the house to Jennifer, a lifetime pension for Deborah, a sum for her grandchildren's education, and a personal letter for Richard. The letter simply said, "My dear son, you've proven that people can change when they find the right motivation. Keep being the man you've become, and my granddaughter will never need to worry about the family's future." At the funeral, hundreds came to honor a woman who had dedicated her life to helping families and who, even in her final years, had managed to save her own. Richard carried the casket alongside other relatives, knowing he also carried the weight of responsibility to honor the memory of the one who had believed in him when no one else did. "She knew it would work from the start," Jennifer said to Deborah during the wake. "How could she be so sure?" "Because Mom always said she knew people better than they knew themselves. And with Richard, she saw the man he could become long before he saw it himself." Deborah stayed in the house as the keeper of memories and guardian of the lessons left by Mrs. Eleanor. The home became a family gathering place where the children grew up hearing stories about the grandmother who had turned a crisis into an opportunity for growth. Richard thrived in his new career, rising to manager at the store where he worked. He never gambled again, never lied to his family again, and always remembered the lessons learned during those difficult months. "Dad, tell me again the story of how Grandma taught you to be a better person," his youngest daughter, now 15, would ask. "Your grandmother taught me that falling isn't the end of the story. It's just the moment you decide whether to stay down or get up and be better." Jennifer became a stronger, more confident woman, knowing she had made tough but right decisions to protect her children and her own dignity. "Mom taught me that loving someone sometimes means saying no, even when it hurts," she would tell other women going through similar situations. The family's story spread through the community as an example of how wisdom and planning could turn seemingly hopeless situations into opportunities for growth and healing. Deborah wrote a book about her experience titled The Fine Print of Love, which became a success among caregivers and families facing similar challenges. "Mrs. Eleanor taught me that protecting someone doesn't mean doing everything for them, but giving them the tools to protect themselves," she wrote in the introduction. 5 years after Richard's transformation, the family gathered to celebrate Jennifer and Richard's 10th anniversary, their second marriage. The house remained exactly as Mrs. Eleanor had liked it, but now it was filled with the laughter of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. "Sometimes I still can't believe it all started with a torn-up contract," Richard said, glancing at the spot where he had destroyed the document years before. "It didn't start with the torn contract," Deborah corrected with a smile. "It started with a mother's love, one who refused to give up on her son, even when he had given up on himself." The table was set with the special china Mrs. Eleanor had saved for important occasions. The children ran through the garden she had tended with such care. And in the armchair where the elderly woman used to sit, a portrait of her smiling now rested, as if she were still watching over the family she had brought back together. "To Mrs. Eleanor's health," said Richard, raising his glass. "The woman who taught me it's never too late to start over." "To Grandma Eleanor," the whole family repeated in unison. And in that house in White Plains, where years earlier a contract had been torn up in a moment of anger and despair, now rested a family reborn by the power of unconditional love and the wisdom of a woman who knew how to look beyond appearances. The last clause of the original contract, the one that provided for forgiveness and reconciliation, had turned out to be the most important of all. Not because it guaranteed legal rights, but because it guaranteed something far more valuable: the possibility of second chances when true love exists. The end. What did you think of this story of transformation and second chances? What lessons from Mrs. Eleanor would you take into your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories that teach us about love, family, and the strength of hope.